What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Monday, you know what time it is. It's time to go over the top waiver ads as we're heading into week 15. Since this is the fantasy playoffs, of course, we aren't going to recommend picking up players who are maybe speculative, players that we typically would stash on our bench as they develop into potential weekly starters. At this point in the season, we just don't have that luxury. This is going to overall thin out some of the options we have available to us, but there are some really solid options this week at running back and a couple solid streamers at tight end and defense as well. Just a reminder, our website is also completely free for the remainder of the season. That's not just going to apply to the rankings, also you can have access to our waiver wire information, which will be updated according to any news and notes that are applicable. With that being said though, let's hop over to the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which wide receiver with at least 5 targets inside the 10-yard line currently posts the league's best catch rate in that area of the field. The correct answer was actually Tim Patrick. Congratulations to Jace, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, through 13 weeks, which running back has faced the highest percentage of light boxes? Once again, that's which running back through 13 weeks has seen the highest percentage of light boxes. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With that out of the way though, let's hop right into the video. We're going to start with running backs as per usual, and if you notice, the first thing you'll see is that there are a lot of names on this list. The range of the types of running backs we have here is very wide. We have our handcuffs, of course, who are very valuable at this stage of the season. We have the backups who are battling for touches and moving up the depth chart, and we also have players like the first player on this list, Cam Akers, who has recently taken over the starting job. Understandably, Cam Akers is not going to be available for all of you out there. He is owned, of course, in 55% of leagues, but that does mean 45% of you out there do have the ability to go and snag him. As for Cam Akers and how he's trending, we know that his volume has been trending upwards. He's had a combined 50 rush attempts on the ground over the past 2 weeks. Meanwhile, no other LA Rams rusher behind Cam Akers has been able to eclipse 3 rush attempts through that span. It also helps that Cam Akers has scored a rushing touchdown in 2 of the past 3 weeks. And with this next matchup in week 15 coming against the Jets, a matchup that should be very favorable, having them projected out for a significant lead the entire game, that's a very positive sign for the potential workload and volume for a player like Akers in week 15. The next running back we have on this list is Philip Lindsay of the Denver Broncos, currently owned in about 44% of leagues. Big news in this ad is definitely the health of Melvin Gordon. Melvin Gordon did get a bit banged up last week in his matchup against the Carolina Panthers, which does bring into question what his availability will be for week 15. With Melvin Gordon taking a backseat in the second half of the week 14 matchup, we saw Philip Lindsay step in, playing the primary role as the running back on this offense, which is definitely a plausible outcome for Philip Lindsay for week 15 as well. If Philip Lindsay is going to play the role of the starter, there is plenty of upside in his upcoming matchup, which is against the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills have allowed a rushing touchdown to a running back in 9 of 13 games so far this season, a trend that could definitely continue with Philip Lindsay at the helm. Philip Lindsay, as we know, is well versed in the receiving game, which should give him a pretty solid floor in this matchup, a matchup that should already be top 10 based on what the Buffalo Bills have been allowing on the season. The next running back we have is Latavius Murray of the New Orleans Saints, currently owned in about 51% of leagues. I understand the ownership for Latavius Murray is high, but I really feel like anyone in the playoffs who has Latavius Murray available on the waiver wire should really be trying to go after him. This goes double for the Alvin Kamara owner. Even though we aren't going to be grabbing Latavius Murray to be putting him in our lineups in week 15, let's just say something happened to Alvin Kamara and you're still able to win your matchup heading into week 16, the fantasy championships, with a player like Latavius Murray, who in a scenario where Alvin Kamara is out has top 5 potential upside. That's definitely a player you don't want available for your opponents, and if you're a Kamara owner, it could instantly replace the loss in production you would get from losing out on him. For that reason, I see Latavius Murray as one of the most valuable handcuffs available, which is why he does rank 3rd this week. Even though we're not using him, he still has a ton of value from playing keep away and could bring in even more value for your team with an injury to Kamara, whether you own that player or not. We have a very similar situation with our next player on this list. That's Jamaal Williams, currently owned in 46% of leagues. And as we know, Aaron Jones is the primary running back for the Green Bay Packers, but there really isn't much question as to who the primary rusher behind point Aaron Jones is if anything were to happen to him and he fell down due to injury. On the season, Aaron Jones has been producing top 5 running back numbers. That's the type of player that we really can't afford replacing the production with a player off of our bench. Having the ability to replace him with the running back handcuff is a much better option, so Aaron Jones owners should already be looking out for getting this player on their team. Once again, that's not to say that if you don't own Aaron Jones, there's no value for grabbing Jamaal Williams. If your opponent in the playoffs does own Aaron Jones, playing keep away is a smart choice, but even if Aaron Jones is somehow on a roster of a team that's already been eliminated, if anything happens to Aaron Jones, you probably have a top 12 running back in Jamaal Williams in the fantasy championships for week 16. The final 3 running backs I would definitely consider more of desperation plays, which while they are going to be getting volume, they're still ranking behind these running back handcuffs. I don't believe these are the types of players we should be valuing as much in the fantasy playoffs as we would when we are in the middle of the season. We don't have time or the luxury for these players to develop, and when it comes to their volume in the competition around them, there is absolutely no guarantee in the volume they're going to receive this upcoming week. And in week 15, if you've made it this far where it's win or go home, you probably have better options and don't need to take the risk. The first player we have in this type of category is going to be Irv Smith. As we know, Todd Gurley has been playing ahead of him for most of the season, Brian Hill as well, but when it came to last week, even though Todd Gurley didn't exit the game due to injury, Irv Smith, he was playing ahead of him and did finish the game with more touches. That does bring into question on what the target and touch splits will be moving forward. Like I said, we aren't going to have the luxury of a large sample size to see how this pans out. We're really going to have to roll the dice, but if you're in a desperate situation and have no guaranteed volume at the RB position, have somehow made it this far in the playoffs, Irv Smith is definitely a player who could come in, get 10 plus touches for you, who's available in 99% of leagues. Behind him, we have Trayveon Williams of the Cincinnati Bengals, and me personally, I would try to avoid this at all costs, but I understand sometimes we really just don't have that option available to us. When it comes to the Cincinnati Bengals run game, they've been pretty weak in this area for the entire season, regardless of which rusher has been starting. Joe Mixon, he's been struggling. Giovanni Bernard has been struggling the most we've ever seen throughout his entire career, which has now paved the way for a player like Trayveon Williams to step in and get some touches. Unfortunately, we won't know exactly what the touch splits are going to look like moving forward, which does make this much more of a high-risk add and play, and also one with a pretty limited ceiling because we haven't seen many Cincinnati Bengals running backs rush with much fantasy success on the season. Their next matchup also comes against the Pittsburgh Steelers, which is one of the better run defenses in the entire league, which in turn will lower the floor and the ceiling for the lead rusher in this offense. But regardless, if there is a running back on the waiver wire who is going to be stepping into a potential high opportunity share, that should be garnering our attention. The final player we have is Lyn Bowden of the Miami Dolphins, and this is definitely a situation where we have addition by subtraction. The Miami Dolphins in the depth at the skill positions has been thinning out dramatically. From the wide receiver position, we now have injuries to both Devontae Parker and Jakeem Grant. As we know, Preston Williams still on IR. And for running back, Myles Gaskin, Salvon Ahmed, and Matt Breida all dealing with injuries, leaving DeAndre Washington and Lyn Bowden to take up most of that production. In week 14 against Kansas City, Lyn Bowden pretty much popped off. He had 7 receptions for 82 yards, and with his versatility being a player who can start as a running back or a wide receiver, and with significant injuries to both of those positions on this team, Lyn Bowden should be in line for a pretty hefty workload in week 15 and beyond. Alright guys, we're moving over to wide receiver, and like I said, I didn't want to add a bunch of names to this list that I didn't feel have startability in week 15 and week 16. What's really the point? We don't have time to see how these players develop. So T.Y. Hilton shouldn't come as too much a surprise that he leads this list. He has now had 4 receiving touchdowns in the past 3 games, a combined 23 targets through that span, and by far has been leading this team from the receiver position at a time where Phillip Rivers has been heating up the most. Week 15, the Indianapolis Colts will be facing the Houston Texans. That's the same team that they played in week 13. And in week 13, T.Y. Hilton saw the most volume he had seen on the entire season with 11 targets, finished the game with the most receptions he's also had on the season, and was able to compile 110 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown to go along with it. That's the type of upside that T.Y. Hilton will bring to this matchup. Week 16, he also has plenty of upside as well, facing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have been hot and cold at defending that position all season long. The next player we have is Tim Patrick of the Denver Broncos, and if you listen listen to the stat of the day, it was which wide receiver with at least 5 targets inside the 10-yard line has posted the league's best catch rate in that area of the field. The correct answer to that was Tim Patrick, who has now had 3 receiving touchdowns over the past 2 weeks. Now, understandably, this isn't going to be a play that's coming with a lot of volume attached to it. This is the Denver Broncos offense, of course, which does have 2 very strong weapons at the receiver position alongside Tim Patrick and KJ Hamler and Jerry Jeudy. Tim Patrick, though, is only owned in 20% of leagues. He's been a premier option in the red zone, and with the health of Melvin Gordon up in the air, the potential for Drew Lock and the Denver Broncos to rely on the passing game over the next 2 contests is at an increased chance than it would be in other games so far this season. The final wide receiver we have is Chad Hansen of the Houston Texans, and one thing we know about the Houston Texans passing offense is that it is very depleted from the wide receiver position. With Will Fuller facing a suspension, Brandon Cooks ultimately being ruled out of the Week 14 contest, and Randall Cobb still on the IR. So when it comes to receivers right now, it's really just Kiki Kuti as well as Chad Hansen. Hansen in Week 14 actually led this team in targets and receptions. 7 targets, he translated that into 7 receptions for 56 yards. Yes, that is a more modest total, but he did receive 7 targets the week before in Week 13. Translated that into 5 receptions, 101 yards, and that was in a game against Indianapolis, the same team that he faces in Week 15. A lot of his value is going to come down to the health and availability of Brandon Cooks. If Brandon Cooks does not play, Chad Hansen can definitely be in consideration as a flexible player. If Brandon Cooks does in fact play, though, I probably would opt for a different option. Alright guys, we're moving over to tight end, and these are definitely more of streaming candidates, but I do think a premier option this week is Irv Smith Jr. Irv Smith Jr. is currently only owned in 3% of leagues. He has been dealing with injuries, but did come back, take the place of an injured Kyle Rudolph, and even scored a touchdown in his first game back. Heading into Week 15, he has a matchup against the Chicago Bears. Chicago Bears on the season have been bottom 3 at defending the tight end position. They've also allowed a receiving touchdown to a tight end in 8 of 13 games so far this season. Last week, although they didn't allow a receiving touchdown to Jordan Akers was wide open in the end zone, was targeted by Deshaun Watson, but unfortunately the sun on that side of the field was directly in the face of Jordan Akers, who just couldn't ultimately come down with the ball. That type of situation is just more fluky. 9 times out of 10, Akers comes down with that ball, scores a touchdown, which would have made it 9 of 13 games in which the Chicago Bears allowed a receiving touchdown to a tight end, and so far Irv Smith has shown he does have the receiving chops to help make that trend continue. The next player we have is Tyler Higbee of the LA Rams. He's currently owned in 43% of leagues, and while I do understand he's been terrible for most of the season, he is coming into Week 15 with a phenomenal matchup. In Week 15, the LA Rams faced the New York Jets, who ranked dead last at defending opposing fantasy tight ends. We cannot forget exactly how dominating the performance of Darren Waller was when he tore them apart for 200 receiving yards and even scored 2 touchdowns. Allowing tight ends to score 2 touchdowns is familiar territory for the New York Jets. They've now allowed 2+ receiving touchdowns to tight ends in 4 contests so far this year, 11 touchdowns on this season, and even allowed the Seattle Seahawks to tear them apart with the combination of Will Dissly and Jacob Hollister. The next tight end we have is a potential streaming option is going to be Jordan Reed of the San Francisco 49ers, and while this isn't going to be a massive upside play, Jordan Reed should play a significant role in this passing offense in Week 15 against the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys have been a matchup that's been more middle of the pack, and while typically we do like to target players in matchups that are against teams in the bottom half of the league or preferably in the bottom 10, unfortunately there aren't many matchups for waiver wire tight ends this week that do fall into that category. This will make Jordan Reed a viable option, while a player with not a high ceiling or a very high floor. If you're in a desperate situation and need to fill this spot with a tight end, Jordan Reed could certainly get the job done in this matchup. The final potential streaming tight end we have is Kmet of the Chicago Bears. He's currently owned in about 3% of leagues, and while there is Jimmy Graham on this roster who is possibly the primary tight end, it's pretty surprising to see Kmet come in and garner a 20% target market share in this passing offense for 2 weeks back to back. Any tight end who's receiving 7 targets is going to be startable. 7 targets is exactly the amount Cole has been able to garner in each of the past 2 weeks. And heading into week 15, he gets a matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, a team that has been pretty much dominated through the air in most of their matchups. Alright guys, that's going to do it for tight ends. I did really quickly want to go over 2 possible defenses you could get off of the waiver wire and stream as early as this week. The first team we're going to talk about is going to be the Arizona Cardinals defense and special teams, which is currently only owned in about 28% of leagues. They are of course coming off of a 20-point game against the New York Giants. While a 20-point game is super impressive, we can't be 100% certain that will be the result in this upcoming matchup. Week 15, they face the Philadelphia Eagles. The Philadelphia Eagles, while heading into this past week, were allowing the second most fantasy points to opposing defenses. Jalen Hurts, he performed very well. The New Orleans Saints defense, which was a premier start at the position, actually put up -1 fantasy points against them. That is going to increase the risk for the Cardinals defense on the week, but that was a 1-game sample from Jalen Hurts. We have a much larger sample on what this offense and coaching staff has been able to put together across the entire season, which does mean the Arizona Cardinals are likely a defense to be on the cusp of ranking inside the top 12. Behind them, we have the New York Giants. The New York Giants defense is owned in about 23% of leagues, and in week 15, they have a matchup against the Cleveland Browns. Now, don't be fooled. I don't want you heading into this matchup thinking that the Cleveland Browns are an offense that we 100% of the time want to target. No, their offense has been feast or famine for opposing defenses all season long. Defenses have either had a lot of success against them or have been putting up very low numbers, sometimes even putting up negative fantasy outputs. 5 of 12 games so far this season have resulted in negative fantasy days for opposing defenses. On the flip side, 3 games against them have resulted in double-digit fantasy points, and 5 games have resulted in 8+. When it comes to the New York Giants and how well they could play against them, I think they have a really good shot at being one of the better defenses facing them, because they've been able to shut down quarterbacks like Kyler Murray for the most part and Russell Wilson the week before, 2 quarterbacks who are in a completely different level than that of Baker Mayfield. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.